Prop 21. So Prop 21 is essentially an expansion of the ability of cities and counties to enact rent control ordinances. One of the interesting things, and this doesn't happen a lot, but one of the interesting things about the Costa-Hawkins Act is that state law right now actually places limitations on what cities and counties can do with regard to rent control. And it's not typically the case. I mean, the general thing is if something is, not explicitly the idea with state and the relationship between state law and local ordinance is typically that state law allows things, and then local laws typically can be more restrictive, right, but not more permissive. So in this case, the rent control, it's actually pretty restrictive on the state level, and this would kind of unrestrict or lessen the restrictions. I don't know what the right word is. Sorry, it'll remove some of the restrictions from the state law. So what it will do is it still places some restrictions on what cities and counties can do with regard to rent control, but it opens up a lot more potential housing units that could be covered by rent control. And the idea there is that right now, no single family homes can be covered by it. Mm-hmm. And with Prop 21, if Prop 21 were to pass, single family homes that are more than 15 years old and that are owned by landlords or property owners that have more than 2 single family properties could be covered by rent control. So it's kind of an interesting distinction. So it's basically carved out an exemption for small time landlords. So if you as a landlord only own 2 single family homes that you're renting out, rent control doesn't apply to you. Mm-hmm. Or to your tenants, I guess I should say, to you or your tenants.
Sure.
Right. But larger companies that own multiple, like, I don't know, like a real estate trust or that kind of stuff, that own multiple single family homes, mm-hmm. own apartment complexes, that kind of stuff. Local agencies could actually enact rent control ordinances that would apply to those things. Mm-hmm. So the current standard for length, so anything built after February 1995 cannot have rent control restrictions on it. If this Prop 21 passes, anything that's more than 15 years old can have rent control. So that would allow a lot more properties to, kind of be rent controlled right now, and then more properties to come in as they age, right?
Sure.
And then there's one kind of interesting thing in Prop 21 will actually, so right now, if somebody moves out of a property and a new tenant moves in, there are no restrictions allowed on how much the rent price can change from person A to person B or family A to family B. Mm-hmm. Right. So one thing that Prop 21 will do that's kind of interesting is that even when somebody moves out of a property and then somebody else moves in, the landlord can only increase the rent by up to 15% for the first 3 years. So there is a cap on how much it can go up from person A to person B, right? Which is kind of interesting. That's to me a pretty big change from the current system, where if somebody moves out and somebody new moves in, you could charge them whatever you want.
Sure.
So I guess before I get too much into the discussion part of it, so that's what it'll do. I guess I should probably take a page from you and give a little bit of my bias. One of the things that I'm a little biased towards is I don't believe personally that rental housing should be a source of significant profit for property owners, because to me, housing is a basic human necessity. And so that's kind of one of my biases, right? I think basic human necessities really shouldn't be where people look to make extreme amounts of profit. That's just, I just don't think it's correct. So the groups that are opposing this have collected over $83 million, and the three or four of the largest donors are all, of course, basically rental housing companies, right? There's also apartments associations and those kind of, landlord associations, business associations, that kind of stuff. But a couple of the really big ones are Equity Residential at 11 million, Essex Property Trust at 11.9 million, and Avalon Bay Communities at 8.8 million. And the best I can tell, they're all large landowners, essentially, landlords, right? So they own lots of property. The main group by far that's supporting this is actually the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, with $40 million contributed out of 40.2 million. So it's pretty much all AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which is, it's neat to see that somebody's supporting this, but at the same time, I'm really kind of stuck on, I don't understand why the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is supporting a rent control change. Based on what I'm seeing, it's a good thing, as far as trying to keep people's rent from going up too quickly, too dramatically and too quickly. But I'm at a loss, logically speaking, on what the connection point is.
I wonder if it's, partially historical, right? Because there was a period of time when people with AIDS were heavily discriminated against in terms of housing, but I don't know the rent control connection. But the other side of that is perhaps it's just and I think John made this point earlier, was that it would sure suck to be homeless and also have AIDS, right?
Absolutely.
But
absolutely.
You're right. It doesn't seem like it's a.
Doesn't seem to be a clear connection.
The first group that I would guess as being funding it, but I don't know. I think where the money comes from. It's interesting to know on any of these propositions. It's really interesting to know where the money comes from, because that it provides a certain context. But for me, I don't necessarily use that as a way to judge the thing, right? Like,
sure, I do in a certain sense. I do in the fact that, if a rental company is willing to put out $12 million to get against something, then that means that more than that is on the line for them. It's an indicator of the level of profit that they're trying to protect, right? Because if this was going to cut $100,000 a year out of their bottom line, they're not going to go spend $12 million.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
But I understand what you're saying too. In this case, it's like I'm not gonna look at the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and go, well, there's got to be some weird thing in here for whatever. No, it's probably just supporting something that they feel is a good thing,
Sure.
But it's all part of the deal.
Just as the landowners are supporting their position, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The thing that
of course not.
that I suppose, at least likely, it makes me object, and likely I suspect you as well, is the amount of profit that it demonstrates, right? Like,
exactly.
These things are obviously incredibly profitable because they have the money to burn effectively against this thing.
And it's just like the dialysis clinics. We know that they're making a lot of money if they're willing to put out 100 million plus on defeating something like this. And so it's a good indicator in that regard, right?
It certainly is a useful data point when considering it.
There's a couple other interesting factors. So, obviously when it comes, the goal here, right, is to make housing more affordable. That's the overarching goal of making housing more affordable to the people who have to rent, right?
Sure.
It's interesting. I thought it was interesting. I found one statistic that said that California has the most cost-burdened households in the United States as a percentage of the total. And the concept they use of cost burdened is households that have to spend more than 30% of their income on their housing,
Mm-hmm.
right? 30% is essentially kind of what most people in the housing industry, I guess, would say is affordable, right?
Sure.
So we have over 41% of all of our households in the state of California have to spend more than 30% of their income on housing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, that hits the lower income brackets a lot harder than it does the higher income brackets, right?
Right.
So when it comes to the high cost of housing in California, several different kind of main threads have come out as why is it so expensive, right? So obviously limited land, limited supply. Those are the big ones, right? So limited land, limited supply of housing.
Mm-hmm.
The issue with limited supply of housing is, so I know that we have a homeless problem, right? But I also know that at any given time we have vacant properties, right? And so on average in 2019, the vacancy rate for rental properties, rental homes was, or rental housing, I shouldn't say homes, but
Mm-hmm.
rental housing was about 4%. So roughly at any given time, 4% of the housing stock in California was vacant,
Mm-hmm.
right? So to me, while, there's the market issue of, supply and demand. I mean, if we're really talking about, having 4% of the houses empty at any given time, then it doesn't seem like the shortage is that dramatic, right? Because a shortage of housing would mean people are either living lots and lots and lots of people in one house, which does happen, or they're homeless, right? I mean, that's kind of the option, or they leave the state, or whatever. But
Sure.
if they leave the state at that point, then they're not our problem, right? So it's one that I have a difficulty. Like I get the concept of, the cost of stuff goes up as the supply goes down and the demand goes up, right? I mean, that's the one of those basic things in capitalism that apparently explains why people get ripped off for things. Um, but but having some level and a reason, I mean, I know 4% is maybe not a big number, but it's only about, I think the national average was like 5 or 5.5%
Mm-hmm.
vacancy rate. So it's definitely lower, but it's not like 20% the rest of it, and it's 0.5% here or something.
Well, so
Um,
a couple of things that
mhm.
come to mind. So I'm sure part of that problem is that it's not 4% isotropically. It's not 4% spread evenly across
Oh,
the state,
absolutely
right?
not. Absolutely not.
And so I assume there's pockets of areas where
Absolutely.
there's just not enough, and there's pockets of areas where there's frankly a glut of available
Absolutely.
housing. And so,
And you're correct, of course. I mean, you're correct. I'm oversimplifying in that regard. But at the same time, I mean,
um,
to say that a shortage of housing is the problem of, I mean, it's keeping people from getting housing.
right.
That I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Well, so the
Getting
other
affordable housing, I would say probably, yeah.
yeah, so that's that the
Yeah.
other point that you brought up, and that you brought up supply and demand, and how market should dictate the price of housing, and how that's all
Which I
supposed to
don't
work.
necessarily
No,
think it
no,
should, but
yeah, right, but like that's your understanding of how it should work, supply and demand, and the market setting the price and all of that, and that assumes that every player in the system is rational, uh, and I don't think that that's necessarily the case either, right? So I think what you end up
most people are not rational,
not
and
not
I'm irrational at times for
not in
sure.
my experience, yes. So I think what you end up with is a certain irrationality in market pricing, that potentially keep housing prices inflated, You know, that there may be people who would be willing to continue to keep their housing empty because they feel that, for instance, dropping the price might bring a certain type of person or whatever, and so that, you know,
Right.
so there's more to the equation than just the market setting the price.
Yeah.
That's the only point I was trying to make.
Absolutely, and you're totally correct on that. And I think that, you know, this is one of those situations where there's a ton of factors that go into this thing, right? But if we go with the capitalist market view, you know, if suddenly we allow people or prevent people from making the profit that they want to make on these things, then, you know, the opponents say, well, then we're gonna make the problem worse because now people aren't going to be building rental housing. I mean, maybe that's true. I don't know, but I would say that if you make less profit per unit, then you're going to want to build more units to try to make up the loss on a per unit basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you have I don't know, if you have a drive-through restaurant, I mean, if you're making less per food item, well, then maybe you want to open a second one or a third one, right? I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable thought process, right? I mean, that's a difference between a mom and pop shop and an Amazon, right? Is the volume, right?
Yes.
So as you increase the volume, you can accept a smaller rate of return on individual pieces. Right?
Yeah, except with a lot of things like this, they don't scale the way that you expect, right? Like, so when you're down at the bottom and you're producing something for X dollars, and you think, okay, well, if I can just, and more importantly, you're producing something with X profit, and you think, okay, well, if I can just spin this up, and let's say spin it up 3 orders of magnitude in terms of you know, get my demand up that high, so that I can make that, and it's going to eat into my profit to do that, but I'll make it up in the volume. But to get to that point, I need to progress through the middle, and often what you'll find is that the middle becomes way less lucrative than either end, right?
Sure.
And so to make it through the middle, you have to have deep pockets, in effect, right? You have to say, okay, we're willing to take a loss for some period of time until we get to the future, you know, point where volume increases enough that we're now profitable again.
Right.
And
like people that have $84 million to blow on ads, right?
That's right.
Yeah. No, and I agree with you, and I'm just kind of, you know, thinking out loud about some of the arguments against it, right?
Yeah.
So the argument against it is, well, if people aren't going to make a bunch of money on it, then they're not going to do it, and if they're not going to do it, then the problem's going to get even worse because there's going to be even fewer houses built, and well, maybe, but if you think about, you know, people or companies that build houses, right, or, you know, develop housing, I mean, they're still going to do that, right? Yeah, maybe they make a little bit less money, but if they want to keep operating, then they're probably going to have to do that.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know if I buy that argument. I mean, I understand it from the purely capitalist sense, is that, well, if you can't make money in this market, then you're going to go somewhere else. You're going to either do something else, or you're going to go build housing in Nevada or wherever.
Sure.
And okay, I mean, I can appreciate that, but maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I don't really know, to be honest.
Yeah. And
I don't like people threatening to stop Uber and Lyft if we don't pass their proposition, right? I don't like this threat of, everything's going to crumble if we do this.
Right.
Maybe, but I think historically things have shown that people adapt.
Yeah.
People
absolutely.
adapt to the new rule set, and people
2020 shows you that, right? I mean,
as Ian Malcolm says, life finds a way, right? So this is a tough one, because, I mean, it's not really a tough one for me, because I just say, yeah, fuck the landlords. Let's do the rent control, right? but there is something to the argument that there may be less housing built in the future because of something like this. But at the same time, the nature of this proposition is to allow all the cities and counties to make the decisions on what's good for that area,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that I think that there'll be a chilling effect on going too far with rent control, because then the town next door to you will be a more lucrative market for the developers to build the stuff.
And
right. And if you talk about two towns right next to each other, and one says, well, you can only you can only do this with rent control, and this one says, well, there's just only a few real minor provisions, they're probably going to develop in that town. I mean,
well, and
just,
what that actually sets up is closer to a real market, right? Where
yes, yes,
where you would have competition,
yeah,
and so each group or
yeah.
each city could compete with each other. So,
Yeah. Now that sometimes can end up being a race to the bottom, right?
yeah,
When
of course it can. Yeah,
we see people fighting over, we see cities, I shouldn't say people, cities fighting over strip malls or
right.
outlet malls
Yeah,
or big, big sales tax generators.
right.
They do these really stupid deals where they basically give back some of the sales tax to the companies,
Yes.
right? Um, but because they've convinced themselves that it's better to get 50% of something than 0% of nothing, right? And so it's kind of a race to the bottom, which I mean is kind of capitalism in a nutshell. But um, I don't know.
So
I don't know.
I, I I I approach this very much in the same perspective as you, Anthony, in that I think things that are necessary for life, like food and water and housing and healthcare, are all things that should not be profit centers. I think, okay, maybe they can't be completely not for profit, but they should not.
Mostly not for profit.
They should exactly.
Yeah.
People should not be becoming billionaires off the backs of these things.
Yeah.
That's it. Just shouldn't happen.
Well,
I think
as
it's
long, I
it's
mean, I don't even care how much actual profit they make. I just care that there's something that helps ensure that people are able to afford it, right? I mean,
yeah.
people should be able to afford this stuff.
Well,
I don't care what the actual like percentage or any of that stuff is, but I do care that whatever it is, it's fair. You know what I mean?
so I would argue though that if you have a billionaire or somebody becoming a billionaire off the back of let's say housing, for instance, then they are overcharging for that thing.
Sure, or
Period,
they
right?
own 100 million units. I mean,
Uh,
I don't
maybe.
believe we should have billionaires at all. So I mean, I'm not like
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not really
Okay.
arguing with
So,
you here, but
fair point. And so I voted yes for this as well. But in thinking about it,
very
I
nice.
the only thing that gave me pause was what about somebody, not somebody, this is all companies. So let's say you have a company who invests in property, not invest, they build a bunch of property 15 years ago. And so now they're falling under this rent control thing. Well, they are 15 years out of say 30 years in paying down the mortgage on the thing that they own, the piece of property. And they did that. They made that business calculation to do it way back when, based on trying to project, how much rent they'll be able to make off this thing. And so it does seem a little wrong to then pull the rug out from under them and say, well, sorry, you don't get to make as much rent as you wanted off these units.
Uh-huh.
And the only thing that I could come up with is, well, they're very likely not. They're not building uh, into their decision way back when, way 15 years ago, that that rent's going to increase at any sort of given rate, right?
Well, I assume they would make some sort of inflationary
Yeah,
calculation,
they're
right?
going to
Of
make a
2 or 3 or 3.5% a year or whatever.
absolutely. So they're going to make a really conservative guess, because that's
Right.
what you're going to do when you're making these sorts of decisions. Is you make a bunch of conservative guesses so that if you know somebody comes along and says, "Oh, we're going to have rent control," you're kind of prepared for it.
Well, and realistically, the the rent increases that have happened have been way out of line with inflation, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that it's pretty fair to assume that most rent control ordinances would never prevent you from at least increasing via inflation, right? I mean, I just don't see that happening because that's not a very smart thing to do.
Sure.
Um, and the courts have said that landlords have the right to a fair right of fair rate of return,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's court law, court cases, and it's also enshrined in Prop 21. So there are some safeguards for landlords. So I mean, there is that, but I think the thing that kind of sticks with me on the issue of that is, if they were anywhere near a good business person or business entity, chances are they got a fixed mortgage, right?
Yeah. Right.
Where the payments don't change and then the revenues go up. I mean, obviously there are certain costs that go up by inflation, all this stuff. But if you set the rents correctly 15 years ago, it shouldn't really be that big of a problem.
That's right. Yes.
Because usually, and probably what's going to happen with rent control is that it's going to be like inflation plus a couple percentage or something like that, because there are going to be situations where you had, oh crap, I had a hole in the roof and I didn't expect that for another 10 years and now I need to, I think that there's going to be some common sense around that stuff. But if if you're planning well, you should be able to take that stuff into account. And I'm pretty sure why there's that no rent control for the first 15 years, right? Because you might need to make adjustments to get where you need to be before the rent control kicks in.
Right.
So there is, again, some safety. There's a safety valve, if you will.
Yeah.
If
so
that's even needed. But
I came to the same conclusion, and I didn't think that this was overly burdensome on anybody. The fact that it didn't apply to small, single housing stuff that not normal people, but that average people might own or whatever.
Non-millionaire billionaire people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the fact that it had this 15-year window, I think the burden's relatively low. I think on the other side of this is that it's absolutely a step in the right direction of trying to deal with one aspect of housing, cost of housing in California. It's not the end all be all, because again, you have to have the local municipalities actually implement it. And there's going to be plenty of municipalities who are just their electorate is not gonna go for. I'm talking to you, Central Valley, where that's not going to be the thing. But
I mean, I think traditionally speaking, rent control has more been of a larger city issue than the suburbs and the rural areas.
Yeah.
One potential thing that I thought was just kind of an interesting thought was, so if the rental housing market is less lucrative, perhaps these companies build more condo projects and that kind of stuff, which maybe helps out a little bit to get more people maybe into ownership, right? And we know that home ownership is one of those things that helps build generational wealth, right?
Sure.
Maybe that's positive to come out of this. If that's, I mean, I think a lot of it's probably just scare tactics and trying to protect as much profit as possible for the
sure, yeah.
for the large landlords. But maybe there are some other unintended, or maybe there's some other potential benefits too. So anyway, I'll leave it at that because I think we've chatted enough about it.
Yeah.
I've talked about it. At least I have. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's
So Prop 21, thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Right.